All right, well, thank you for coming. As you can see from the screen, and of course you knew from your program, that the topic is the first of two parts, the post-Christian future, part one, thinking theologically about the utopian impulse as a perversion of the Judeo-Christian worldview. Now, I'll confess that this session, and to some extent the second one, is sort of a thought experiment on my part, because I've had my head in the sequel to The Facade for a while now, and one of the trajectories I want to try to chase down is this thing that I'm calling here the utopian impulse. And that's in part prompted by where we are at culturally. It's also prompted by some of the cultural and political trajectories that I see. I mean, what we think of as conspiracy, and I think a lot of it is small c conspiracy, but is not actually new. There's always been sort of this impulse to either create the perfect society or, more pertinently, force it on people. And so I see looming on the horizon a new effort at creating a wonderful, blissful, totalitarian state. And I want to sort of pursue that a little bit and talk about it. And again, for those of you here, for those of you who listen later to the presentation, I just want you to get you thinking about why it is that this always seems to rear its ugly head, and why even Christians at times are not immune from this notion that we can make things perfect, that we can just make it all right. If we did this, that, and the other thing, everything would be okay. So I want to try to think theologically about those things, and we'll see what happens. So here's our roadmap for the day. I'm going to be trying to define what I mean and then give you the elements of utopianism. And then I'll give you some examples, and then we'll move to an evaluation section. And I want to sort of strip away the mask of utopianism, and then critique it a little bit, again, theologically, in light of biblical theology, and then talk about how in the world did we get to where we're at, and sort of what we might be looking at. Again, these are going to be broad strokes in this session. In the next session, I'm going to be a little more specific as far as what I think we're going to be having to deal with as a believing community, okay, as the real church in the future. So, first part, definition and relevance. Utopia, as you may or may not know, again, is this idea of a perfect human society. The term itself refers to an ideal place that actually doesn't exist. It's imaginary, it's conceptual, it's this grand wish, something that can't be real in the real world, but boy, we wish it was, that sort of thing. And again, the breakdown for the term utopia, no place, a good or no place. Again, you'll see it spelled either with the E or with the OU, forming the U in either case, but it actually could have either derivation depending on who's using it. And again, an imaginary world where social justice is achieved, whatever that means, and the means of guaranteeing all that are secure. That's where the control comes in. So that's what we're talking about. And as far as the impulse, what are the elements? I mean, if you are utopian in your thinking, what are you thinking? What are what's in the forefront of your mind? Now, these things are not all present all the time, but they're all important to different utopian systems. So as far as elements, there's typically an ecological element, and that is the idea that we ought to be existing in a harmonious relationship to nature. And the buzzword, of course, today is sustainability. But there's something to do with humanity's relationship to their environment, okay, to its environment. So something to do with nature, the world, the created order. Some would use the phrase creation, of course, and means something entirely different than what you and I would mean. But there's some ecological element typically. There's always an economical element that usually focuses on egalitarian thinking, egalitarian distribution, so that everyone out there is just free from need. Again, we're going to talk about how this is spun, and then sort of what the reality always turns out to be. But as we go through these, I want you to be thinking, well, who in their right mind would oppose any of this? Well, in principle, sure, we'd like, we're not in favor of, hey, who all out there wants to rape the environment and pillage natural resources? I mean, nobody's going to say, yeah, let's go at that. And we wouldn't say, well, my optimal view of things would be that lots of people don't have enough to eat. So there we go. I mean, nobody's going to say something like that. So it's easy to sort of float the idea, but then where the rubber meets the road is always, well, what exactly does that mean and how is it accomplished? Other elements, political, again, this ambition for world peace. Again, who would want world war or lots of war? Freedom from crime. Again, these are all desirable things. The key is going to be, though, again, how do we define what's a crime and what isn't? What's criminalized and what isn't? And then how do we bring this to pass? What are the enforcement mechanisms? And who's the target? Okay. So there's this political idea, and then there's an equality idea, equal rights, multiculturalism, and of course, gender neutrality, in our day especially, is a big element of this. And again, these things are usually cast or put opposite things like racism and male domination, defined again as a situation where earlier in our history women couldn't own property, in the 17th, 18th century, even into the 19th century, didn't have control of their children in a divorce. It was all male favored. So all these things that we'd look at now and say, well, that really wasn't a good idea. So yeah, sign me up for that. Okay. Again, there's a way that it's marketed, but there's going to be a reality to it that doesn't quite conform to the marketing. Progress is a big element, this idea of human improvement, and that can mean improvement of life, quality of life issues, but in our day and age it often means improvement of the organism, okay, in various ways that, again, some of which we would certainly buy into medically. But, again, as I'm going to mention in the next session, part 2, this drifts into other areas that are kind of icky, okay, kind of, things that, probably wouldn't want to go down that road because who knows where that's going to end, and how that's going to go. Science and technology, of course, are always a part of this idea of progress. Then there's a religious element, and this has historically taken three forms, one of three forms. You either have utopian communities that are anti-religious, and that is, science and nature kind of rule the day. Nature, in effect, is really the substitute divinity. Then you have omni-religious utopianism, where that's basically all religions blend into one, either the effort to create some sort of unified religion or it's, in effect, a free-for-all. And of course, that creates the condition that if you ever raise your hand and object to anything, then you're in the way. Okay, then you're an obstacle to the utopian idea. And you have also had Christian utopias historically. And some of these, drift into, some wacky areas of theology, but others are more communal-centered, and their theology is more or less what we would define as orthodox, but it really had to do with a lifestyle. So there's some variation here. Examples of these elements in practice, again, there are political utopias, where, again, has nothing to do with any sort of religious impulse. There are some Christian utopias historically, and then there are what I would term pseudo-Christian, either things that sort of pass themselves off as Christian, but are theologically aberrant. So you get all different kinds. In the ancient world, Genesis 2 describes a utopia. That would be the one I would vote for, the good one. But it's, again, an ideal state. It's the Edenic state. So that is part of biblical theology. Outside that, though, probably what scholars would point to as sort of the earliest utopian idea would be Plato's Republic. And as we read this in the 21st century, there are things in there that would sort of make us recoil, like, well, that can't be a good idea. But for Plato's day, it was really revolutionary, the ideas that he communicated in here about an ideal society. Augustine with the City of God. Again, Augustine's trying to argue that the world state is not the primary ideal, but again, this city of God as he defined it, Christian community, ruled by God, so on and so forth. And regardless of what you think about Augustine, a lot of what he says in here could could fall into the sort of innocuous or theologically abstract category. But a lot of his thinking was used later to legitimize the Crusades, for instance. We have to bring in the kingdom. We have to make the world, our part of the world, we have to make it Christian. We have to make it the kingdom of God. And so that didn't end really well. So it's an example, again, of, we realize that the papacy, of course, is motivating a lot of the Crusades, and it was largely political. But again, it was sort of baptized, using the ideas of Augustine and others. And it just went off in a misguided direction. And I would say in many ways it was misguided from the beginning. 16th century, Calvin's Geneva. I know some of you might be John Calvin fans. And not to take away from Calvin's genius, because he wrote the Institutes when he was 29 years old, didn't have things like concordances and Bible software and stuff like that. So the guy obviously has a lot going on upstairs. But the problem is, if you actually look at Calvin's Geneva, you probably wouldn't want to move there. I mean, he's throwing people in jail for referring to him as Mr. instead of Master. Someone smiles at a baptism, and so that's prison time. And there are all sorts of things that if you read through the history of Calvin's Geneva, it had the feel of an attempted utopia, a theocratic state, run, of course, by Calvin. So there would be some things there that would make us uncomfortable. If you were living in Calvin's Geneva, you had better be a Calvinist, for instance, or it just isn't going to turn out very well. Thomas More, Utopia. This is where the term really entered the regular discourse with More's book. More again is casting this imaginary idea, in part as a critique, for what he saw politically going on around him. But all of these literary attempts, I think are worth reading because on the one hand, they show you what the person's thinking, and boy, wouldn't that be wonderful, and then you turn the page and you get into enforcement. All of them require power. They require power structures to make this work. Because guess what? People are not robots. And no matter how good you make it sound, at some point there's going to be dissent. So what do you do with dissent? Well, we can't have dissent because this is utopia. We have to eliminate that. 17th century, we get Thomas Hobbes with his famous book Leviathan. Again, and this is the book that really focuses on the empowerment, the power situation of the state over people, again, to enforce this sort of perceived ideal community. Francis Bacon, The New Atlantis is really an important book. This one has a significant influence in the United States and America because, again, there were many, and it wasn't, you didn't have to be sort of a dyed-in-the-wool Freemason to think this way, but there were many, who would have been outside Freemasonry and just sort of in the Enlightenment discourse that would have looked at America as the new Atlantis. Again, this is the new utopia. We come here to get away from monarchy, to get away from the social ills that we see in Europe, and we get to basically start over, and we get to reimagine what communal life should be, what the ideal state would be. And, when Bacon writes New Atlantis about this imaginary place somewhere else, outside of Europe, that people go to and really start this thing called civilization over again. When people, when America is discovered, of course, by Bacon's time it was known, but when people start to migrate in serious numbers to North America, this is what they're thinking. This is the new Atlantis. This is the great country, the wonderful, country where we get to actually conduct these experiments, in reimagining what life should be like, what the state should be like. 18th century, the Shakers. I'm from the East Coast. I'm from Pennsylvania originally and grew up near the Shaker area, the Shaker community, and the Ephrata cloister. In fact, my first daughter was born in Ephrata, not at the cloister. But the Shakers were a Christian community. So was the Ephrata cloister, but again, Christian. Again, there would be some things going on there that you would sort of would raise an eyebrow, or you might not recognize as Christian. But again, ostensibly, they were not atheists. Certainly, they were not secularists. They're trying to do Christian things. They tend to be very strict in terms of celibacy. I don't think there are any Shakers left anymore. Again, celibacy was part of the problem there. I think the last Shaker died like in the 1990s or something like that. I mean, you can still go see the community, and then of course the cloister. The cloister has more connections with transcendentalism and some of the quasi or overtly kinds of occult things later on in its history. But again, it's not exactly where it began. So you have, again, these sorts of early attempts at, let's go over, we create our own community, we share our own goods in common, we have our own rules for the community, that sort of thing. We separate ourselves, we isolate ourselves from the mainstream way of doing things. The Enlightenment contributes a lot to, again, utopian thinking. The Enlightenment, of course, terribly important. Again, the age and elevation of reason, human reason. Well, if you're in Europe, and again, you've been living with centuries of monarchy, and you don't like aristocracy, and you see all the abuses there, the real strict division of classes and economic states, and you think, boy, we ought to be able to do this better. That we ought to be able to think for ourselves, and we ought to have checks and balances in our government. We ought to have power divided among many, and all these political ideas we're familiar with that actually are sort of launched in the Enlightenment. Well, they launch movements. Of course, we have the American Revolution, which I have listed second here, but chronologically it preceded the French Revolution. The American Revolution was, a violent revolution, but as far as the transition of power and the establishment of power within the community, we had peaceful transitions, from presidency to presidency and so on and so forth. This is why after Washington left office, people were really nervous. Is this actually going to work? It was a big deal that he stepped down after 2 terms. And that established the 2-term tradition. It was not written into the Constitution initially. That had to come with an amendment. But when you had the transition to a new leader and the election was really close, like a couple electoral votes, is this going to erupt into chaos and that sort of thing? And it didn't. Now, the French Revolution is quite a different story. What's going on over there? It was on the one hand, we had a guy like Thomas Jefferson over here, who was a Francophile. Everybody knows that, and he was he thought the revolution was great in France until this isn't like the internet where you get instant information about what's really going on over there. So gradually he starts hearing about children being guillotined and stuff like this, and Robespierre and all this, and he's like, wow, boy, that's just not really a good thing. I mean, so eventually, it becomes distasteful even to somebody like Jefferson, who was like all things France. But again, both of these things, even though they sort of worked differently and took divergent paths, were fueled by the Enlightenment ideas, again, of building the ideal, the ideal state where everything's fair, everybody has enough, that sort of thing. 19th century, again, we get Second Great Awakening. I think actually this contributes to utopianism as well because of the rise of post-millennial thinking. And that is, we need to bring in the kingdom so that Jesus can come back. That's what post-millennialism is now. Post-millennialism in the 19th century was a big deal because, again, we have this, it's hand in glove, or it works in tandem with populism because of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. And the way that industrial revolutions typically work is that wealth, and of course with it power and political influence, comes into the hands of a few, again in the merchant class. I'm thinking of people like J.P. Morgan, Kay Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie. This is the era for that. And again, I'm not saying that everything these guys did was bad, because it wasn't. A guy like Carnegie, felt that it was just immoral to pass on your wealth, so that's why he decided to give it all away. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. Not everybody felt the same way as Carnegie. Carnegie, of course, wasn't perfect himself. He had the problem with Homestead and all that. But because wealth is so highly concentrated in the hands of a few, and you get this real disparity between the wealthy elite and then the worker, okay, that creates problems across the board economically for most of the population. So it's a serious thing. And one of those that really suffered were the farmers, because people were moving from the rural parts of the country into the cities because of urbanization. Again, everything's becoming mechanized. You get factories, the whole factory system, the assembly line idea. The demographics in the country are changing dramatically. And the farmers are hurt by that, and they're also hurt by the fact that the money supply is controlled by a very few people. So to get low, I mean, there are instances in the 19th century where you can read that lenders were charging 300% on a bank loan, stuff like that. And farmers need capital to buy land, they need to buy machinery, so they're just getting killed. That all factors into the rise of the populist movement, which is a grassroots movement where, again, we, as farmers unite, we united labor, the farm industry, but then that becomes an appeal because right down here you have transcendentalism going on at the same time. This sort of utopian idea of wonderful, harmonious coexistence with the land, again, with nature. And so you have in populism, again, these sort of murky ideas of the rise of the masses to create this wonderful, harmonious, state. We want equality. We don't want this distinct classes and social classes and economic classes. And again, we're the farmers. We're the ones that are close to the land. We get our hands dirty, and we ought to be, doing sustainable. All this rhetoric was in place in the 19th century, and so that gets married to this idea of, hey, if we can pull this off, then Jesus can come back, or Jesus will come back. You had postmillennialism as an eschatological system develop during this time. And it actually led to very utopian thinking within the church. William Jennings Bryan is probably the best example. Ran for president, I don't know how many times. He never won. Obviously, probably more famous for the Scopes trial later on. But again, he was a significant figure in this whole era. Charles Finney, okay, again, post-millennial thinking. It was a big deal. Transcendentalism, I've mentioned, again, Walden Pond, Henry David Thoreau, the Alcotts, Walt Whitman, all these people. This was a more, and I'll use the term pagan approach. And what I mean by pagan is, paganism is at heart is about worship of the earth. It's about this swap out for a personal transcendent deity. We're going to do away with that, and we're going to view nature as our divinity, as our divine focus. It's very monistic. I'll be talking about monism a lot later this afternoon in part 2. The idea that everything is one. Nature is God, God is nature, everything that is unified, all this. It's the Oprah theology, of today. So, I mean, all of this talk that we associate with the New Age movement and Oprah and all that sort of thing is transcendentalism, plus a few other threads too. It's nothing new. But there were 3 communities that were deliberately started in this country that were transcendental utopian communities. Again, it was all about harmony with nature and the ecosystems and all that stuff. Marxism, of course, 19th century, an economic theory, again, really aimed at, quote unquote, leveling the playing field economically and getting rid of all these, class divisions and class warfare to start revolutions to bring in what? A better society, a more egalitarian, equal society. It's an inherently utopian idea. Again, an economic theory that, of course, takes different forms politically. Edward Bellamy, he was a novelist looking backward. It's just a famous work describing a utopian community that looks a lot like, he imagined himself to be in the year, I think it was 2000. And he's writing in the 19th century. And so, again, he's creating this vision for this ideal community. Some of it would look, oddly like what we're looking at right now. Again, with some of the control mechanisms and the way things are. But it was a very influential book at the time. 20th century, we get progressivism. We've all heard a lot about that recently. Again, the idea of human progress, all these utopian ideas, it's the same old stuff. Of course, with progressivism and H.G. Wells, with his works, Modern Utopia, Men Like Gods, The Shape of Things to Come, again, utopian ideas. And progressivism and H.G. Wells, of course, a lot of their thinking was influenced by eugenics. Okay, again, to create the ideal society, you need ideal people, right? You need to sort of weed out the unfortunate or less desirable elements to the human population. So that was very common in the United States. A lot of later Nazi eugenic theory and practice was drawn from American and British writing, and those were the seed beds to some of those things that would come later on. Marxist Leninism, of course, this would be the Lenin experiment with Marxism. Of course, the revolution of 1917. Again, the working class. We're going to create the community where the worker is in power. We know how that worked. But again, ostensibly, this is how it's marketed. This is how it's put forth. Huxley's Brave New World was a critique, and some would say a parody of H.G. Wells's utopian visions. Because if you've ever read Brave New World, it's sort of the world without pain, really the world without any sort of trouble. It's a utopian vision, but because of some of the stuff in there, what you need to do with people and to people to accomplish this, it's very dystopian. It's very, scary. I don't know if you've ever read Brave New World, but I do recommend it. National Socialism, again, Nazism, again, used a lot of utopian thinking, utopian techniques, utopian goals. They tied race to it, specifically in certain ways. There were certain occult threads that drove their view of the different races. Again, all of these things have more than one thread, but they're all attempts at creating the perfect state. And of course, the perfect state is always in the mind and the eye of the power holder, okay? The one who gets to define all that. Communism, another example. George Orwell, again, Animal Farm and 1984 are obviously critiques of this. 1984, one of the scarier books I've ever read. If you've not read 1984, well, I was going to say I recommend it, but in this day and age, maybe not. it might put you out on the ledge. Somebody would have to talk you off the ledge, because a lot of 1984, you could see, man, you could just implement this really with a snap of your fingers today. But 1984 is really, frightening. And Animal Farm is in its own way as well. Again, I recommend both of those. Atlas Shrugged is also a utopian element, even though that's popular with a lot of conservatives. If you've read Atlas Shrugged, and I enjoyed the novel, but I recognize that the author is an atheist, and a lot of her, Ayn Rand's, thinking is certainly contrary to good theology. It's an entertaining read, even though it's 1,000 pages long. It's very clever. But Galt's Gulch is a perfectly utopian community. Okay? If you've ever read the book, you know that. Hippie movement, the 1960s, again, bringing in the age of Aquarius, where everybody's equal and there's no war and all this stuff. Again, the themes are familiar. Of course, the American left, as we know it, grew out of that. And you also have right-wing religious cults. That they're, again, it's utopianism, but just from a different trajectory, a different angle. So, again, none of this is really news, but I wanted to show you some examples anyway, just to sort of put it in your mind of what I'm talking about. Let's talk about what's really behind it. Now, the utopian impulse, again, pre-20th century, again, this is how it's sold, this column over here. And really the modern reality as we've experienced it in the 20th century, and as I believe we will keep on experiencing it in the 21st century. So over here, here's how it's sold. Here's the marketing. Oh, sustainability, shared resources, plenty for everybody, freedom from need. And of course, over here, that means that food is under state control. That's the only way you can accomplish this today. Okay, you have to have the food supply under control. And that means, and it explains why, and I'm hoping a lot of you are aware of this. If you want the copy of the slides, by the way, so that you can get to this link, we're not connected to the internet here, but that link will show you, I think, half a dozen, 7, 8, 10 ways that already the food supply is being really controlled. And things as simple as the family farm are being defined in such a way that they're being criminalized. Okay, this is not accidental. It's not that. I'm still willing to say. I realize there are a few people who absolutely know what they're doing here, but there are a lot of legislators that are frankly clueless in a whole number of areas, and so they think that I'm doing a good thing by voting yes for this because we don't want people to get sick on this farm where things are not controlled and there's no FDA and all. I mean, they think they're doing the right thing, when what they're really doing is they're putting structures in place that will disallow anyone the right to feed themselves. Again, it puts food under state control. There's a movie called Farmageddon, a documentary. Again, that one you might have to be talked in off the ledge, okay, after you watch that. But again, it's this sort of thing, again, what's happening legislatively. But you have to have this to make this work today. So, food, of course, the Henry Kissinger quote that food is a weapon, of course, is sort of famous or infamous, because we've actually done this, in the Korea and the Vietnam, situations, where part of the strategy was to keep the populations from getting food. I mean, that was just a tactic. So there's population control, there's deliberate shortages. Of course, if you control the food supply, you can put additives in there. You might also want to watch a film called, let me see if I can remember, I can see the cover here in my head, Demographic Winter. Okay, it is an absolute utter myth that the population is growing too large. The reverse is actually true. And again, this is me. This is Mike Heiser. This is Mike Stick in the Mud Heiser, okay? I am not given to exaggeration. I don't do my research on Billy Bob's website, okay? I do peer-reviewed stuff. And you watch Demographic Winter. They're real scholars, they're real specialists in the fields, and it's very easy to document that we in the West are undergoing a dramatic demographic shift just by, it's just a numbers game. That's why it's called Demographic Winter. Europe does not have the birth rates to sustain its population. We are right on the edge. There are 5 or 6 European countries that are actually under the demographic number required to sustain its own population. Now, the only communities that aren't conforming to that within Europe and within the U.S. and in other parts of the world are the Muslims are the big ones, because it's part of their, it's both part of their religion and part of their political outlook to have big families. In the West, because we're civilized, and we have things like abortion. By the way, Demographic Winter is the hidden cost of abortion. The victimless crime, it is the hidden cost of abortion. And the people in the documentary actually go through that. How abortion has led to this situation where we cannot sustain our population. So, it gets into all sorts of stuff like that, but there are these shifts going on. And part of that, the reason that made me mentally rabbit trail, is this additive thing. Again, there have been situations where it has been at least suggested, and we can talk again whether, small c, big C, conspiracy kind of stuff, whether it's actually been implemented. Again, that's the controversial part. But the non-controversial part is that it's been talked about and could be done, is you put additives in the food to kill off or to decrease the sperm supply. Okay, essentially, and that reduces, again, the population. Eugenicists are very open that we need lots and lots of people to die off to have, to have sustainability. And rather than just sort of advocating, hey, we need a few world wars in succession, that'll take care of the problem, rather than do something like that, it's demographic control that is just far more convenient and effective and frankly marketable. So again, I recommend, Farmageddon, Demographic Winter. There's actually 2. Demographic Winter has a sequel to it too. It's not exciting. It's kind of chilling, but it's good stuff. It's real, it's real scholarship. Political manipulation, again, if you control the food supply, well, then it's kind of easy to get people to do what you want them to do. Would you like to obey, okay, or not eat? Okay, I'll wait for your answer. It's not difficult to imagine. And again, we have regulations that are keeping people, again, from growing their own food just by zoning regulations. You don't really realize the power of regulation. It's invisible. It's not overt. It's not, in your face. We're manipulating you. But, who wants to go to zoning hearings and stuff like this? It's just boring. Like, I have a life to live. I'm not going to get involved in that. Are you kidding? I don't know if I could even stay conscious. But, while we're thinking that, it's just happening. Again, it's just this invisible laying in place of structures that are going to be called upon as precedent later, for certain things. So we'll move on. Ecological, again, here's how it's sold, the harmony with nature, so on and so forth. God is in all the world, that's panentheism, as opposed to God is nature, God is the world, pantheism. Environmentalism. Well, what you get is you get neo-paganism as civil religion, as the secular cultural religion. Again, emphasizing the wonder of nature, the transcendence. Think about the vocabulary I'm using here, because I'm using it deliberately. The transcendence of nature. I just get warm fuzzies, thinking about that. But this is what they're talking about, the idea of an eternal consciousness. Consciousness studies, spirituality, so on and so forth. These things are not new. You also get, in some quarters, scientific materialism as the civil religion. Again, fueled by atheistic natural selection, which when combined with social Darwinism, again, applying principles of natural selection, survival of the fittest, to the way society operates, to classes and class structures. And of course, eugenics is part of that. Nowadays, of course, we refer to eugenics as genetic engineering and genetic selection. Okay, genetics is just the new eugenics. And again, that's not to say I'm not here to demonize all genetic research, because that would just be ridiculous too. But once you have the power of the genome in your hand, eugenics is like really easy. It's just how do we accomplish this thing we can easily do now on a wide scale? That's the only question you need to ask. Politically, of course, world peace, freedom from crime. Who in their right mind would oppose that? Well, I'm not opposed to that. I am opposed to statist fiefdoms that are, if you're a statist, you are anti-individual. Okay, think about that. So that means if you're in control, you get to criminalize practically anything. Criminalize self-protection. That would be like gun laws, taking guns away. Okay, we're going to criminalize your ability to protect yourself. Why? Because your emphasis is on the state, okay, the utopia, as opposed to the individual. Citizen self-sustenance, we talked about that with the food supply. There's always, you have each individual state, state being defined as country here, trying to implement their view of perfection here, their view of the ideal situation. But ultimately, you have a push toward global government, and there's lots. This link right in particular here, again, doesn't lead to, sort of a private researcher or something like that. That link will actually lead to an official federal government watchdog entity, like an official media group. It's run through the Heritage Foundation, in fact. So there are people, again, even within groups that the wider culture would recognize as credible, actually keeping their eye on global governance, because they know that it's real. There are really people, lots of people, who want that. And since the Heritage Foundation, again, is focused on principles of individual liberty, they don't want that. So they're keeping their eye, and it's a nice site because it's sort of a gateway or a clearinghouse for lots of information that's official. Official documents on global governments, because they collect that stuff and post it on the site. Of course, the UN, which is inherently anti-national, it's inherently global, and Agenda 21, which I don't think we need to really comment any further on, because we sort of all know what that is. But all of these organizations, again, trying to push toward a global state, okay, as opposed to, again, individual national states. Equality, of course, equal rights, multiculturalism, gender neutrality. Don't you Christians are nuts. Don't you want women to vote and all this? You want to go back to the 18th? Again, this is how it's marketed. This is how you're forced into sort of intellectual compliance. But the modern reality is that opposing views on any of these ideas and anything related to them are marginalized, and in some cases there's an effort to criminalize any sort of opposition view. There's an inversion of sexual norms. Basically, nothing is aberrant anymore, because we can all just say it's biology. Again, and we can say that because we now have nature as our God, or scientific materialism as our God. So we have perfectly consistent theology, by saying, hey, it's just biological. Everything's biological. And of course, if you disagree, then there must be something wrong with you. That's a psychosis. Okay? It is funny, But it's really not funny because, again, if you look in some of the scientific literature, especially in psychiatry, they're defining, your resistance to what appears to everyone else as normal and good. That's a psychosis. Okay? Try to get health care. And that's just the beginning of how you can be manipulated and pushed into whatever direction. So it's a serious thing. Of course, nationalist culture is going to be vilified because we need to be multicultural. We need to be global. And so any sense of individual sovereignty, of course, as we saw, is like, well, what's up with that? And naturally, any sense of national sovereignty is going to be viewed as either aberrant or oppositional to the good that the global state could bring. Religion, again, we saw earlier that we have some that are anti-religious, omni-religious, or Christian. Of course, anti-religious, in our day and age, we've really seen the rise of what I would call militant atheism, as opposed to nice atheists. You have a lot more militant atheists, again, and they're actually viewed as more reasonable and more tolerant. Tolerant is a big buzzword. More tolerant than a lot of Christians. Why? Because the militant atheist will agree with the gender neutrality thing. It's all biologic, all this stuff. Scientific materialism as the substitute for God. They're going to agree with a lot of these things, and so they actually are marketed or market themselves or are marketed as more reasonable than these stodgy old Christians. Omni-religious, of course, paganism, again being defined as the elevation of nature to the status of deity. Paganism, the scientification, if that's a word, of the supernatural. Now think about that. I don't know how many of you are into things like, quantum physics and, chaos theory and that sort of thing. I dabble in a lot of that stuff. I'm by no means an expert in it. But one of the things that you're seeing is basically using and things like chaos theory and quantum theory do not of necessity drive the conclusion that there is no immaterial reality. I know lots of physicists personally that understand quantum theory very well, and they're Christians, and they're serious Christians. They don't think it requires a substitute for the truly non-material. I don't like the term supernatural for this reason because it has the word natural in it. But it's not a necessary conclusion. However, there are lots of people who will use the quote-unquote new physics to basically attach a natural explanation to everything you thought was supernatural, everything you thought was immaterial. And if it's all material in some sense, then it's all natural. It's nature. Here we are back again. Intellectually, we complete the cycle to substituting nature, the created world, for the creator, blending them. That's what monism is. Okay? Monism, again, the idea that everything is one and one is everything and all that stuff. There's no creation distinction. Okay? You deny that if you're a monist. So, we have this going on religiously, and of course, anti-Christian basically, unless Christianity adapts to this, especially this in our day. I'm going to talk about this in the second session with what I view as the new Gnosticism. It's going to be criminalized and demonized. Progress, again, human improvement, science, technology. Human control is what this means in our day and age. So, whereas we would call it progress, human improvement through science and technology, what it really means is control of people through science and technology. We have information control. In other words, we'll fill your head with what it needs to be filled with. Knowledge, of course, is power. It's easy to propagandize things like the political process. Eugenics, of course, that's progress because we're weeding out, we're clearing out the gene pool there. Isn't that a good thing? Police state, we have to have a police state to enforce progress. Commerce, of course, comes under state control. I mean, basically everything you do, if it's viewed as being an impediment to progress, then it needs to be controlled or eliminated. Okay, one of the two. I mean, we have to be able to keep the progress going. We don't want progress to stop. Now, utopian impulse as a biblical perversion. And this is where your handout comes in. I'm going to go through this quickly, and I'll tell you what the handout supplements. Here are the fundamental myths of utopianism. The idea that humans are perfectible, okay, that's a myth. It either on an individual level or a corporate level, it ignores, again, human capacity for evil. It ignores, the condition of the heart. But it's a myth that drives utopianism. The other myth is that you can force human perfectibility. That just isn't going to work. So enforcing an Edenic state, in other words, it would be Eden by human effort. Eden created by a ruling human elite. Again, this is mythology. So human utopias require total control, and they are ultimately dystopias, the opposite of what they claim to be. I would say this is all contrary to a Genesis theological narrative. It's contrary to the meaning of the divine image. Of course, if you've read any of my stuff, you know what my views on the image are. The image is not a thing put in you. It's not a quality. It is a status. It's a status that utilizes the qualities we have as humans. But if you say the image is a quality, then I don't know why you're anti-abortion, okay, at least prior to brain formation, because you have no theological argument then. If the image of God is a qualitative ability, I'm sorry, but the single-cell zygote after conception does not have any of that. So if that's your definition, you're in a lot of ethical deep water there, and it would be easy to, undermine your view of abortion. So my view is actually based on a point of Hebrew grammar, which I won't get into here, but the image is a status. We are created as God's imagers. We are to be him. We are to represent him. That's on an individual basis. So inherent within the image idea is the idea of freedom, free will, and individuality. It just goes with the program. Okay? It reflects what God is. Evil and the shared image, again, there's a reason why there are plurals in Genesis. Again, because we are created in God's image, we have free will. Free will is an absolute necessity because it is a communicable attribute of God. If you were not free, if you could not make legitimate moral free will decisions, there is no way you could be like God. And that's the point of the image. You're like him. You would be a robot. God is not a robot. God doesn't share the attribute of robotability. Okay? It's just nothing like that. It's essential. And so, again, we have this idea of being able to make a decision, that there's freedom here. And of course, that also means that we're going to have evil because people are going to choose poorly. Genesis also democratizes the image. Let us create humankind in our image. Okay, that language in the ancient Near Eastern world is unique because the only people who represented God in the ancient Near Eastern world were who? The ruling elite, the kings. This is why they were conceived, and I mean that metaphorically. They were considered to be either divine offspring or put in their positions by the gods. They were the gods' representatives. Genesis says, no, it isn't just for ruling elite, it's everybody. Everyone is an imager, every human being. And that's very contrary, again, to the utopian idea, because, again, we have to have these power brokers. You always have to have an elite to enforce the utopia. Human imperfection and mortality, again, that is part and parcel of what we read in the Genesis narrative. We are imperfect. We are mortal. We are less than God. We are not gods. Okay, there is no such thing as this perfectibility. The assumption of authority and sovereignty, again, we will be as gods, that whole, again, misguided idea. Again, if you look at what happens in Genesis 3, part of what the serpent says is true. That, when you do eat, your eyes will be open and you will become as Elohim. That's what it says in the Hebrew. You will become as gods. It should be plural there because in verse 22, God says, well, the man and the woman have become as one of us. Okay, there's the plurality there. The idea being that, look, now we have human beings who now have assumed sovereignty. Whereas God was in control before, and God had laid out his will and said, there's this thing called Eden that you're living in, and wouldn't it be nice to stay here? Isn't this a wonderful place? You can stay here indefinitely, and you eat from the tree of life. You're not going to die. You have contingent immortality because I'm the only being that has immortality in and of himself. but we'll set that aside. Wouldn't you like to stay here and live forever with me? Serve me and interact with me. Wouldn't that be great? So, God has this plan for human authority, human shared rulership, with him and other humans and other non-human beings as well in Eden. And that gets corrupted as soon as humankind presumes the right to dictate the terms and to propel the program. So, we have that going on here. And then we have separation from Eden again, and this is really something, absolutely against utopia. Now, your handout is a fuller description of this symbiotic relationship between the biblical view of the divine counsel, God and God ruling through his counsel on earth, the way things should have been, and then once the fall happens, God's continued interaction with humanity, again, through himself and through his counsel. So what you have in those 6 pages, I've drawn excerpts from an article that I really like and would recommend, but they're excerpts that sort of trace the flow through the Bible of that idea. Okay, so that's what the handout is. Babel, again, is a big deal with this because if you understand what's going on at Babel, a ziggurat, Tower of Babel, was built to bring the divine to earth. Okay, we're going to build you a house. We're going to build you a home because gods live on mountains. So let's build our own mountain so that the deity will come here. And then when he comes here, we can negotiate. We can kind of barter. It's the same logic of idolatry. Why do people? The ancient person wasn't an idiot. He knows that this thing he just made isn't his creator. So why do they make idols? Because they believe deities can be summoned to reside there. You locate the deity. This is why Israel was forbidden to make graven images, because Yahweh cannot be tamed. Yahweh will not be brought anywhere for negotiation. That's up to him. Okay, it's a completely different perspective on it. But you have the same thing going on with Babel. We are going to reestablish Eden. We are going to bring the deity back to earth. We're separated from the deity now. We got kicked out and all that stuff. We're going to bring the deity back down to earth, and then we're going to do all this stuff, all this good stuff. Well, again, it's a usurpation of God's plan, God's punishment. Humans trying to remedy and re-kickstart what they ruined. Okay, Babel is sort of the beginning living illustration of this idea that, hey, let's bring heaven to earth. Again, utopian thinking. Heaven is not going to come to earth until God wills it and not before. But that's what the utopian misses or hates. Take your pick, one way or the other. So again, how did we get here? I have to wrap up. We've got all these forces. Again, I'll send you the slides unless you want to watch it on the video again. But we've got all these things going in our culture, all these political movements, out of what I call lemming capitalism here, as opposed to philanthropic capitalism. All these things, and really what it comes down to, I like this one, checking our brains out at church. I think that's contributed. And checking the brain out of the pulpit, too. All these things have contributed to the future. And here's what I think for sure we're going to be looking at. We're going to be seeing more decline, more statist power, more emphasis of the state over the individual in this country. Technocracy, all these mechanisms used, again, to control information, to control behavior, to control the population. And we're going to see a further marginalization of what we would look at as biblical Christianity. And I think the solution to this is not going to be popular. But this is the proven solution. And that is the church has to be willing to suffer in this generation for the next. It worked the first time. There were 13 people who pulled this off. 12 apostles and Paul. Okay, they won. It worked. But it came at a huge cost. So, I understand we can look at our world and go, what in the world are we going to do? I would suggest that we do what the apostles did. And that is not going to be easy. As Peter tells us point blank here. Paul, do you think Paul knew what he was talking about? We felt that we had received the sentence of death, burdened beyond our strength, all this stuff, despaired of life itself. But that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on the God who raises the dead. We thought we were dead, so we'll depend on the God who raises the dead. Okay, it's not a popular solution. It doesn't involve forming militia groups. It doesn't involve taking the law into our own hands. But it is the tried and true method. It has worked in the past, and I would suggest it'll work again. It's just going to be a generational thing. So we have to be willing to do that. So that is the end of the presentation. If you want to keep up with me, please follow me on Twitter. It's exciting, let me tell you. More importantly, if you want information about the facade, either the special edition or the sequel, please go to the site there, fasadethebook.com, sign up on the email list so that you get the alerts and the updates. And of course, my contact information is on my homepage too. So, do we have any time at all for questions? Probably not. We can cut it. All right. Well, thank you for coming again. Part 2 of the continuing saga, the post-Christian future. Again, just like the first one, if you've not watched the first one, I would recommend that. You don't have to have watched the first one for this one, but this is sort of a continuation a little bit of the thought experiment, but I'm going to show you a few things in this one that are a little more concrete, and I would say definitely contemporary in terms of ideas that are currently in circulation that we need to be aware of and we will ultimately need to think about. So the subtitle here is Pop Culture as High Priest of the Post-Christian Religious Worldview. So what I'm going to focus on is talking about the post-Christian culture, the post-Christian condition, and then sort of zero in on how, in the post-Christian world, what you're going to see as far as the morphing of Christianity. And I'm not saying that the morphing is going to be good. In fact, I'm suggesting that the morphing is not a good thing. And it's really going to morph into something that's actually very old. And we'll talk about that at that point. So this is going to be sort of, hey, here's what I think it's going to look like. And it's not really just opinion, because I'm going to show you what people are saying right now. Okay, that the futurists, scholars in religious studies, scholars in pop culture, that sort of thing. And we will comment on it as we go. So, by way of a sampling, what are the kinds of things futurists are talking about? Specifically, I'll start with this excerpt from something called the Center for Future Consciousness. The two people behind this website and this organization are the Lombardanos, and they have sort of a statement of purpose, statement of principles for explaining what it is they do. And these are just a few of the comments. You'll notice that they're really oriented to this idea of gaining a holistic understanding of the present capacities and potential future evolution of consciousness and the human mind. Again, so there's what I want to plant in your minds right now is this whole idea of the human progression, human upward evolving, so to speak, and this theme of consciousness. Okay, these are just going to be data points that we're going to return to. They're also interested in the future possibilities in science and technology that we're going to encounter, and of course their impact on humanity in terms of this, upward evolution, and again an evolutionary perspective on reality in the future. So this center, the Lombardanos, again, are quite well known as far as being futurists that would be invited to conferences and write books and all this sort of stuff. And so this is what they're thinking about. Now, typically, and this is from one of the Lombardanos' PowerPoint presentations, they're typically thinking of the future as some sort of techno-utopia, where transhumanism is a big part of it. Technology obviously goes without saying, but again, they're sort of vision casting, not just in terms of gadgetry, okay, but specifically in terms of a set of ideas that they feel are going to both dovetail with and derive from advancements in the sciences in particular. And as the sciences go, religion is going to sort of be dragged along or morphed or transformed with it. And so there's a whole set of ideas there. And this is where I want to sort of orient for the rest of the time. Techno-utopian values, again, the usual suspects here. Progress, purposeful evolution, human power over nature, material or technological advancement as the key to success in the future world, all this sort of stuff. Freedom, of course, really translates to don't give me any rules or any dogma, so I can be free. Happiness and hedonism, right in their presentation. The singularity is something we'll talk about momentarily, but I want to zero in on this document, a Cosmist Manifesto. Okay, right here, this one here. And here are the 10 points. I've abbreviated the annotations for the Cosmos Manifesto. But here are the 10 principles, 10 points. Humans will merge with technology to a rapidly increasing extent. It's a new phase of the evolution of our species. Now, you might be thinking cyborg here, okay, which is one way to think about it. But if you know anything about nanotechnology, that's an invisible integration. That's something you never see. But it has the potential. Once you have control over every atom in your body, I mean, every molecule, you can change the human species as we know it. And this is going to be, and is now. I mean, you can buy whole books on the ethics of nanotechnology. I mean, I've read a couple of them this year again to get my head into the sequel to the novel. And they're talking about things like elimination of disease, optimizing the human DNA for its various potentials. And they're really ultimately talking about immortality, because you're dying cell by cell. And every cell is made of molecules and that sort of thing. Well, if you can control and release nanobots into the body, so to speak, that instantly repair cellular loss, you have potential immortality, other than somebody shooting you in the head or something like that. I mean, you get the idea. You will not age. You will not decline as a physical specimen. So this is how it's going to be cast, but this is the sort of merging they're talking about too. It's not just what we would sort of think of as a cyborg. Humans will develop sentient artificial intelligence and mind uploading technology. Now, this derives from, and I don't want to get too far into this, but the current mind-body, what even theologians and futurists and neuroscience, not neuroscientists, call the mind-body problem. That is, are you your brain, or are you and your brain separate? Well, if you are your brain, then we can tap into the right places where the brain stores what you think you are, again, your internal thoughts, your memories, that sort of thing. And if that can be uploaded, when we think, into another body, but what if it's uploaded into a machine? You don't actually have a body anymore. This is the kind of things that we're not talking, this is in science fiction, but you'll actually read academic literature discussing this. It's not science fiction in that sense. Humans will spread to the stars and roam the universe, again, to meet and merge with other species out there. Won't that be wonderful? Humans will develop interoperable synthetic realities, again, virtual worlds able to support sentience, again, self-awareness. Some uploads will choose to live in virtual worlds. I mean, maybe I want to continue my life in this virtual world over here rather than this one. That's what they're talking about. Of course, then, the question of what is real becomes sort of blurred. Humans will develop space-time engineering and scientific future magic beyond our current understanding and imagination. That, translation, technology that does stuff we can't really even conceive of right now. Space-time engineering and future magic will permit achieving by scientific means most of the promises of religions. Oh, that's interesting. Many amazing things that no human religion ever dreamed. Eventually, we'll be able to resurrect the dead by copying them to the future, or of course to some virtual reality, of which we can be a part. Wouldn't it be nice to sort of, keep living with your loved ones, with what they are in terms of their, brain synapses firing in a virtual world forever, as long as somebody doesn't pull the plug. That's kind of a problem. You kind of need the electricity there, but intelligent life will become the main factor in the evolution of the cosmos, steering it toward an intended path. Technological advances will reduce material scarcity drastically. Of course, everyone will have all that they need, of course. We talked about that the last time with utopianism. New ethical systems will emerge, well, I guess so, based on principles including the spread of joy, growth, and freedom through the universe. And 10, all these changes will fundamentally improve fundamentally improve the subjective and social experience of humans and our creations and successors. Again, this is the points of the Cosmist Manifesto. Now, let's say that a lot of that stuff just sort of takes off and becomes reality. A lot of it, in fact, I would be willing to say all of it is in some form on the table now and either being planned or in some cases the initial starting points for it are already implemented. In other words, we're on these paths already. And again, I'm not talking about science fiction writers. I'm not talking about wacky Christians that just, are sort of, conspiracy minded and all. I'm talking about people who don't really give a rip about religion or anything like this, that are working in these fields, and this is the future they see. This is the future they envision. This is the future they're working toward. They're IBMers, okay? The commercials and all that stuff. This is why they got the job and went to graduate school, because they want to do this stuff for whatever set of reasons. So what happens if this trajectory keeps running? What happens to Christianity? Well, again, what I'm going to show you here is how I think Christianity will begin to ape or adapt itself to this future. And again, I'm not saying this is a good thing. We all know already, this isn't news to anybody, that church as we know it is already this self-adapting thing to the trends of the world. Okay, we already know that. So what might we see more of and might see develop? Well, I think God will become spoken of as an eternal divinity. Well, that's kind of nice. God's eternal, isn't he? Sure. God is and always was. He is eternal consciousness. And in some respect, we would say that now. But again, moving Christianity, either keeping it the way it is in terms of the biblical text, biblical Christianity, retaining that or destroying it is a matter of controlling the vocabulary. It is not difficult. If you control the vocabulary, you win the day. Right? All it takes is the implementation of mass media, which what I really mean by that is repeating it often enough to enough people, that thinking shifts. It's not difficult. This is as simple as you can make it. It's just a logistic issue. Okay? So God is and always was. He's eternal consciousness. We have monism instead of dualistic theism. Monism, again, is the idea that everything is one, all is one. Dualism, which biblical theology requires, is a firm separation between creator and creation. So material reality, material matter at the quantum level, convinces us that materialism is an illusion. Now, you have physicists already saying this because of the way they apply quantum physics. Well, think about that. If matter is an illusion, and I realize your minds are already probing the inconsistencies of that statement. Just hang with me. If matter is an illusion, well, then isn't everything God anyway? If God is the only uncreated thing, the only thing that's not matter, and if matter is an illusion, then why don't we affirm monism? Doesn't it make sense? Doesn't monism make sense? It's still God. God's still eternal. Why is that a problem? Again, you control the vocabulary. Quantum physics, again, this whole idea. This is from Paul Davies, who's, of course, a well-known physicist. And he talks about quantum theory here. The old assumption that the microscopic world of atoms was simply a scaled-down version of the everyday world had to be abandoned. Newton's deterministic machine was replaced by a shadowy and paradoxical conjunction of waves and particles governed by the laws of chance rather than the rigid rules of causality. This is physics today, and it's the reality of physics today. Now, for biblical theologians, the question becomes a simple one. Well, maybe this does reflect God in some way. Maybe God made it this way and we just didn't understand it. Okay, that's different than redefining God, okay, by virtue of what you're looking at. So, again, when you go down to the smallest level, and we realize even in this is made of atoms, and atoms are jumping around all over the place, and quantum theory says none of that behavior is predictable, so that this thing we call matter is just completely chaotic, completely random. It creates illusions of real things for us. If this is what we're talking about, then matter's an illusion anyway. So isn't everything God then? Isn't it all divine? So we have this eternal divinity idea. We'd also have an eternal humanity element to our Christian theology in the post-Christian context. You could say things like our soul and our mind and our body is a totality, and that's the Hebrew view, don't you know? Eternal consciousness can't be located. It's not limited spatially. It's everything, and it's everywhere. Again, this is quantum physics applied to the human body, the human mind, the human soul. We are all part of the same undefined, unlimited thing that we would call God. We're all one. Transpersonal psychology is part of this. And for those of you not familiar with that term, this discipline studies the transpersonal or self-transcendent or spiritual aspects of the human experience, basically trying to psychologize spiritual experience, spiritual belief, that kind of thing. Transpersonal experiences may be defined as experiences in which the sense of identity or self extends beyond, that's the trans part, extends beyond the individual or personal to encompass wider aspects of humankind, life, psyche, or cosmos. Again, trying to take all of our religious experience, all of our religious ideas, all our thought life, and reducing that, psychologizing that, which means you link it to something in the brain which has evolved, okay? And since matter is immaterial anyway, and is sort of an illusion, we're just a reflection of everything else that is, which is God. It's a nice theology so far. So we have God is real, okay, like that. But he's eternal consciousness now. All of creation is a reflection of God, consistent with modern science and the material world, and experiences that transcend material reality are just as real since consciousness is real. So therefore, prayer and premonition and prophecy, visions, providence, even transubstantiation, that idea from Catholicism, heaven, even hell, because those things are just stored in your memory banks. They're a result of things you've heard and how your brain processes things. Reincarnation, ghost, deja vu, all of it is real. All of it is affirmed. It's as real as this podium right here. But again, this podium is an illusion because we know that from quantum theory. And we're all just part of everything, and everything is part of us. We're all God, and God is all of us. I don't know about you, but I'm getting a warm fuzzy right now. Hey, this will preach.
There you go.
This will preach. Yeah, I know it sounds funny, but it's true. What does it cost you? Well, you lose the creator-creation distinction. That flies out the window. Yeah, God is very real, but he is not personal. He's not a personal entity. He's a thing. He's everything, and everything is him. And there's no individual entity that exists outside of creation anymore. And what's the distinction between God and man? Well, not much, really. Other trajectories, divinized humanity. Now, we've already touched on this. And again, I'm not denying that the future world will still not embrace biological determinism and Darwinism, that sort of thinking. That's part of it. But what I am talking about are things like human enhancement and transhumanism. We tend to think, oh, this is sort of ugly. Sure, humans have lots of flaws, but I kind of like being human. What's wrong with that? It has advantages too. Well, if we go down these roads, we could argue that, hey, enhancing our species and transhumanism is the meaningful goal of our evolution. In fact, it's not only a meaningful path, but we're really, when we do this, we're acting like our conception of God. Isn't God intelligent and creative? And you realize I'm talking about God as though he were a person and then denying it in the other breath, because that's what you're going to hear. Okay. Again, you control the vocabulary. genetic engineering that's a good thing. Genetic selection. Hey, you weed out the bad, you enhance the good. That's nanotechnology, nanomedicine. I mean, if we find out ways to sort of, become immortal and, and we like this life, that's fine. If we don't, well, we'll just inject ourselves into some virtual world and we all get to live forever anyway. But it'd be nice to be conscious of the fact that I'm living forever. I know I'm an eternal being anyway because matter's an illusion and all this stuff. But I kind of like to know it, experience it. So if I can't experience it in this world, I'll experience it in some other world. So yeah, I'm in favor of para-humanism, chimeras, because we're just making ourselves better. This is the natural goal. This is what we ought to do because we want to progress, don't we? We don't want to just stay what we are. That's not progressing, is it? It's staying and progressing. I mean, it's easy to understand which word means what. Neural implants, mind uploading, all this artificial intelligence. The singularity is sort of this thing that futurists angle for, which is defined simply here as the theoretical emergence of greater than human superintelligence. Now, once that happens, the future becomes unpredictable because since we're humans now, we can't really imagine what that would look like. Maybe when we evolve to that point, then we'll kind of get a grip on it. But right now, we really can't. So this is what, again, this is what is looked forward to optimistically, okay, that we want this to happen. So what does the new man look like? Well, we image God. I mean, we are God, but we image God. Well, what does that mean? Well, we already know that we're God, but when we seek to progress and advance and do great things and empower ourselves and become one with nature and all this stuff, we're kind of behaving like God would if he were really a personal God. So we image him. We're doing the things that a God would do. And so that's consistent, isn't it? That's consistent theology. We're fulfilling the dominion mandate. Hey, that old Bible thing talks about, that God, putting us on earth and saying, subdue the creation and have command of it and all that sort of stuff, and find out what makes it tick, legitimizing this scientific enterprise. Those are good things that Christians should do. Resurrection is not needed, because consciousness is eternal anyway. But hey, if you want to keep experiencing the world as you know it, we can pull off resurrection here with nanomedicine and all that sort of stuff. You'll continue to be immortal. And if you die, if you die in the right circumstances, we can probably bring you back or upload your brain somewhere else and you'll be okay. So we're becoming what the God of the Bible, myth that he is, in terms of personhood. We're becoming what God intended. We're actually fulfilling our own eschatology. We're in command of our future. We're eradicating disease. Wouldn't the Bible approve of that? Come on. We're transcending racial and gender divisions, just like heaven. That whole thing about in heaven you neither married or given in marriage. None of this racial stuff matters. None of this gender stuff matters. Why can't we have that now? It's rebuilding Eden in our own image. To satisfy ourselves is what we're really getting at. So what's the theological cost? Well, we become divine apart from God's plan of glorification. It redefines salvation only in terms of the end, glorification, rather than it dismisses the means, which is the cross, and the whole reason for it, which is sin. But hey, doesn't the Bible talk about humans being glorified and being in the presence of God? Well, I kind of think that the New Testament's talking about, our new techno-utopia here. I know the Bible makes it sound like God's a person, but we've now discovered through science that, again, matter is an illusion, and we're all part of the same stuff that makes up the universe. And so, how much more divine can you get? How much more beyond human can you get? So, why should we worry about what this primitive book says? I mean, at the base of it, it was correct. Okay? The supernatural is real because there's really no such division as natural and supernatural and all this stuff. I mean, I'm manipulating the vocabulary all over the place here because I only have an hour to do it. If I have 50 years to do it, I can take it one piece at a time. It's not a difficult thing, especially if you have churches filled with people who aren't looking for any of it, and frankly are biblically illiterate. I mean, let's just be honest. They're not thinking about this, and I don't want to say church shouldn't be about fellowship and about broken people getting fixed and stuff like that. That people do have real needs. I get that. And frankly, I'd rather that kind of healing occur in church than anywhere else. But that is not all it is. And I think we've sort of drifted into what we get from pulpits on a weekly basis is psychology. We get felt needs stuff, rather than anything that smacks of content. There's a low toleration for thinking in church, which is really going to put us in trouble at some point. I think it already has. But what about Jesus? Well, Christ is divine, of course. He was probably a human being that just understood all this stuff before we did. He was so far ahead of us. It took us to the 21st century to figure this stuff out, but Jesus was already there. He was either a human who fully grasped all this wisdom and taught it for posterity and was in fact willing to die for it, for the truth of all this. Again, what is that? Well, knowing that we would never cease to be separate from God, that we're all one. We're one with God. And the Jews didn't like that, so they killed him. But Jesus is a great example for us then. Or he might be a manifestation of eternal consciousness. Maybe eternal consciousness, those little quantum particles, that sort of, like some of them became us, maybe some of them became Jesus and just brought all that advanced knowledge with him, all that sort of thing. Or, and when it gets right down to it, Jesus may have died on the cross, but he still lives. He's eternal. Right? We're eternal too. Doesn't the Bible say that? Doesn't the Bible describe human beings as eternal souls, really? We just get these bodies for a temporary stay here on earth, but we are really eternal souls. Don't you guys know your Bible? The new Christology, Jesus lives and always did live. See? The eternality of Christ. We can affirm that. Jesus is our eternal brother. We're united to him. Salvation in this embodied life is being released from the fear of death. That was Jesus' message. Believe in what I'm telling you, and you'll have eternal life. Knowing that death is nothing and we will be with God forever, Jesus was the divine messenger to humanity of these truths. That will preach. Okay, it's already preaching. Well, what do we lose? Well, we don't get Trinitarianism anymore because we can't really talk about persons when we're talking about God, so that's kind of a weird peripheral thing. The traditional gospel, the meaning of the cross, Christians of a century ago just sort of misunderstood that, but we get it now because we know more about the eternality of ourselves and our world and the universe, frankly. And salvation, of course, this definition would sort of deny our nature, and it elevates our co-divinity with the Father and Jesus. That might make Christians of 100 years ago uncomfortable, but we know what that means now. We're just all one. We're just all eternal. So in summary, post-Christian Christianity actually has an old name that's been around for a long time, and that name is Gnosticism. Tried and true. Now, I debated on including this, and I'm looking at my time, and you know what? I think I can, so let's go for it. We'll try to be speedy here. This will be a really quick overview of what Gnosticism is if you don't know what it is. I drew this from a series I did on the Da Vinci Code. Someone out there may have seen. So what is Gnosticism? The basics. Well, the Gnostics believe that there is something they refer to as the true God, or the light, or pneuma, which is spirit. And isn't God a spirit? Doesn't John 4 say that? Okay. God is a spirit. He's pre-existent. This God is pre-existent, uncaused, and perfect. Sounds pretty biblical so far. Gnostics imagined the true God of being both male, the Father, and also female. And the reason they thought this was because everything else that exists is produced by this God. So in the Gnostic, this is the early couple centuries AD, and they don't really necessarily know where babies come from and all that kind of stuff. So they're imagining if this one true God produced everything, there must be something male in there and there must be something female, and then they produce offspring. So that's how they wrote about it, to communicate the idea. Now this true God, or the light, exists up here in its own realm. And then, so there's this sort of barrier that they sort of conceived of. There's the residence of the true God. And then down here is the created material world, which is really a far distance away from the true God. This is us down here, material stuff. And in the middle, there was this middle world or spiritual world. And that was populated by other gods, other divine beings. In Gnosticism, they are referred to as aeons. And so the true God essentially took bits and pieces of himself, or this divinity thing that pre-existed everything. Out of that comes different entities. And you notice I have the male and female here. And these are the spiritual beings, the other gods, that the true God creates to do whatever he needs them to do. And again, below them is the created universe. They're beyond the universe here. This is down here, the world we know. So these are the true God's essence in different forms. Together they are referred to in Gnosticism as the pleroma, the fullness. Collectively, all of these beings are the full essence of the true God. Now, in terms of cosmology, the highest eon is called in Gnosticism the Logos. Is that a familiar term? Okay, this is the highest son of the true God, the Logos. The first eon, the first emanation, the first act of the Father. He is the entire likeness and image of the true God. And these are Gnostic statements. Okay? He's the form of the formless, the body of the bodiless, the face of the invisible, the word of the unutterable. All these things. And he actually possesses the knowledge of all the eons. He is unquestionably superior. He's the top dog, the top eon. Now, the Logos, right here, again, is the top. And together, the Logos with the true God, the Father and Mother element in the true God, form the triad. Well, let's just call it a Trinity and be done with it. It's not the same as a Trinity. If you know your Trinitarianism, this is not the same. But they're using the three language. Now, as the Gnostic story goes, one of the eons, in fact, the one closest to our world, the lowest eon, but still an eon, was a female eon, and her name was Sophia. She decides, I love the true God so much, I want to be like him. And he did all this creation stuff like he created us. So I want to create too. But I know that he doesn't really want me to. But man, I just can't resist the impulse to be like him and create. So in Gnostic cosmology, she does that. She rebels and decides to create her own thing, her own entity, just to sort of try it out and be like the true God. Now, the result of that, Sophia, I don't know why she's not appearing up here, but she's not. The result of that, if you look at what Gnostic texts say, the Sophia wanted to bring forth a likeness out of herself without the consent of the Spirit, the pneuma, the true God, or any consort. She didn't have any other help from any of the other male eons. And so a thing came out of her that was imperfect and different from her appearance. Why did she do it? Well, the Gnostics, of course, view this as a transgression, so they have nasty things to say about Sophia. That she was lewd and the great cosmic whore and all this kind of stuff. What she makes is referred to in Gnosticism as the demiurge, which fundamentally it means the maker. Okay, we'll get to why. He's also called Yaldabaoth, which is the child who comes forth, also called Saklos, the fool, also called Samael, the blind one, also known as Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God of the Bible. Why is he blind to a Gnostic? Why is he a fool? Because he's arrogant enough to deny that there are any gods beside him. He ignores the eons. He ignores his superiors. He's blind. He's willfully blind, and he's a fool. Now, the demiurge is sort of a a deity unleashed to the Gnostic. Here's our little barrier to our world. As the God of the Bible, the demiurge is the creator of our heaven and earth. And the demiurge says, you know, I created this heaven and earth thing. I think I'm going to create something else. I think I'm going to create archons, rulers, to help me administer my own affairs in this heaven and earth, this universe. Archon, of course, is a biblical term. It's used in the New Testament for the principalities and powers and all that stuff. And he also says, you know what? On earth, I think I'm going to get together with the archons and we're going to create and enslave humans. Does this sound like Zecharia Sitchin, anyone? He's a Gnostic. Okay, that's all it is. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he never knew he was a Gnostic, but he was. Now, Sophia, which you can't see here for some reason, was horrified at this in Gnostic cosmology. She's like, boy, did I make a mistake. And now these poor humans, they're just going to be slaves. What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? You know, I can't really like tell everybody what I do. You know? What do I do? What do I do? Well, what she decides to do is she decides to inject some of her divinity into the man, into humanity. So he's not just a lifeless, brainless, soulless critter. He's more than that. He is. And so, as he procreates with Eve, so is every human really inside divine. Now, what the problem is for Gnosticism is the human beings have to discover that. That's salvation in Gnosticism. Salvation in Gnosticism is knowing. Knowing what? Knowing this, that you're really divine. What your material world is a world created. The reason there's evil is because its creator is evil. He has built evil into the world, and you're trapped in it. Your only hope is to transcend this life by knowing, by learning and knowing that you are divine. You are in some way attached to the eons and attached to the true God. Does this sound familiar? Okay. And this, this is Gnosticism. This comes from ancient, texts. This is nothing new. It's centuries, millennia old. So if you look at our previous trajectories, we have an eternal divinity. Well, that there, what we're really talking about is the true God. All this evil that you experience, the true God has nothing to do with that. He's good. And we're talking about eternal humanity. Obviously, we are eternal beings. We are divine. And the Logos, man, he's important. He is the top dog. Now, the rest of the story in Gnosticism, who's the hero? The hero is the serpent. Because it's the serpent who comes to Eve and says, hey, I got a question. Did God really, and by God he's referring to the maker of heaven and earth, the demiurge. Did God really say that if you ate of this tree you were going to die? And she says, yeah, we eat it, even if we touch it, we're going to die. Now that part she's making up. But he says, you're not going to die. If you eat of the tree, your eyes will be opened. You will become as gods. You'll become as Elohim in the Hebrew text. So the Gnostic views the serpent as the hero. He is trying to inform humans of their own divinity, of their own connection back to the true God. And the demiurge punishes him. So it is a severe inversion of the Genesis story at that point. But it'll preach. I view Gnosticism as the one ring. The one ring that unites and binds all of it, everything. You will find East and West thinkers articulating the very same thoughts. If you're familiar at all with Eastern religion, what I've just been going through is like, yep, bing, 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 point for point, okay? It's just cast in a cosmological story that's different. All the elements are the same. It unites East and West. It unites all religions. Now, not necessarily all adherents, because there are Gnostic Christians, and then there are those of us who aren't Gnostics. But yet, within the umbrella thing we call Christianity, there were a lot of Gnostics. And there are a lot of Gnostics today who will take the term Christian. There are Muslims who are Gnostic, Muslim mystics. You can just read the mystical literature across the board in any religion. You're going to see all of this, okay, all of it. Evolution goes very well with it because we're progressing. We need to awaken to the fact that we're divine and then realize, like, wow, we live in a world where we really can understand that all of matter, all of reality, and this thing that we imagine as God, it's all one and the same. It's monism. Everything is united. All these experiences that people have or that I've had, they're real because of this thing we call consciousness. Our bodies are just a filter, like a radio filters sound waves. Our bodies filter consciousness. That's why we have deja vu. That's why we have this experience, that experience, visions and prophets and all this stuff. It all works. It's all real. You get to keep it all. You get to affirm it all. So I think it's comprehensive. It's being validated by science. And what I mean by that is a lot of science writers are saying things that if you're a Gnostic, oh, you love it. Now, there are a lot of science isn't directed toward proving Gnosticism. What I'm saying is a little bit different. That Gnostics have plenty to choose from in the hard sciences to say, we're right. Now, a particle physicist might look at them and say, you're nuts. Okay? The physicists I know would, who are believers, who are dualistic and Christian. But the Gnostic doesn't care about that. Because you know what? You know what the Gnostic knows that a lot of Christians don't know? That their numbers are increasing and your numbers are decreasing. You are becoming marginalized. Our view is becoming popularized. Okay, we'll get into pop culture here. But again, the academy's there, and of course, pop culture. Science, I'm going to run through this real quickly. This is a book, if you're into this, if you're into the physics, theoretical physics stuff, I would recommend reading this. It might infuriate you, but James Gardner is a lawyer by training, but he's published in peer-review journals. He's into cosmology. And his first book was called Biocosm, and he advocates, now Ray Kurzweil, this is Kurzweil's opinion of the book, which is positive. Kurzweil is the guy who wrote the book The Singularity. We just, had a quote there from him. Gardner's selfish biocosm hypothesis proposes that the remarkable anthropic or life-friendly qualities that our universe exhibits can be explained as incidental consequences of a cosmic replication cycle in which a cosmologically extended biosphere provides a means for the cosmos to produce one or more baby universes. Now that's a little dense, so let me try to unpack that for you. In his Q&A, Gardner's Q&A on his website, we have this. Question, what are the religious implications of the biocosm hypothesis? The hypothesis is inconsistent with traditional monotheistic notions of an unknowable supernatural creator. Well, that's honest. There's a discernible and comprehensible evolutionary ladder by means of which mortal minds will one day ascend into the intellectual stratosphere that will be the domain of the superminds. Question, is biocosm just a religious screed in disguise like intelligent design? No, biocosm is adamantly and consistently naturalistic in focus. Now, from Amazon, here's, I think, a better idea of what Gardner's saying. Gardner proposes a startling theory that a pre-existing super intelligent race that inhabited a mother universe, some other universe, created ours and tweaked the physical laws of our universe, of the baby universe they made, to ensure the continuity of intelligent life and itself. So all that design stuff that you creationists out there think is the hand of God, it's not. It's the hand of someone else. And all that evidence for the Big Bang, that the universe had a beginning, well, it did, but it was birthed by another universe. In other words, it creates the visual impression of a beginning. But there was something before it, and before that, and before that. It's eternal. It's an endless regress. And this is peer-reviewed. This is in physics journals. Okay, this is not like my website where I'm trying to pretend I'm a physicist. Okay, I'm not. Now, Gardner's second book, The Intelligent Universe, Artificial Intelligence, E.T., and the Emerging Mind of the Cosmos. In The Intelligent Universe, James Gardner envisions a third dramatic alternative, a final state of the cosmos in which a highly evolved form or group of intelligent engineers, has anyone seen Prometheus? Okay, engineers, a cosmic renewal, birth of a new universe, blah, 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 blah. Okay, I'm going to skip the other stuff about Gardner. He quotes Gardner commenting on Orgel and Crick and life itself. If you're familiar with Crick, one of the co-discoverers of DNA, he believed in directed, intelligent panspermia, that life on this planet, including DNA, was seeded by aliens. Now, Gardner critiques that a little bit. Basically, he's saying, I'm a little bit smarter than Crick here. But Crick was one of those biology idiots. We're physicists here. Now, what about religion scholars? This is Jeffrey Kripal. He is a professor at Rice University, PhD, University of Chicago, and an author that I think you should become acquainted with. This is his book, The Serpent's Gift, Gnostic Reflections on the Study of Religion. Okay, Kripal is a Gnostic. I'd run into him every year at the American Academy of Religion. Okay, that's what he does. This is from a review. This, again, is a peer-reviewed review of Kripal's book. And just look at what it is. Knowledge is the serpent's gift. Knowledge of good and evil, moral and ethical knowledge. We have not been expelled from the garden by the aforementioned petty and jealous God. We would have gone on to taste the tree of eternal life. Again, we forsook knowledge and turned to faith, like they're mutually exclusive. Okay, again, this reviewer is reviewing what Kripal says, and very positively. Though most of us would agree that modernity has had its heyday and the postmodernists make some very good points, we have yet to name a successor that can constructively direct us as a body of discourse forward into new forms of knowledge and understanding. And this is where Kripal steps in and reminds us of gnosis, not just a bunch of dried out scrolls buried under a layer of pigeon doo-doo, but a viable, promising, indeed perfectly appropriate methodology that can take what is best from modernity and the Enlightenment and leave what no longer works and carry reason and the critical method forward, transformed into what is, for better or worse, a postmodern era. He's saying, look, we've had modernism, postmodernism, and the next thing that needs to happen is we as academics need to commit ourselves to Gnosticism. Okay, this is a religion scholar who teaches at Rice University. Now, I'm going to speed ahead here. Let's see here. Because of pop culture. Now, the way Gnosticism is conveyed to us is typically through stories about extraterrestrials and superheroes. Okay? Because extraterrestrials, they can be the gods of old, they can be the archons. And again, you'll find this too, the discussion of, hey, are there similarities between the archons and this ET stuff and blah, blah, blah. And superheroes, of course, who are part human but part non-human. They're evolving, they're mutants, they're progressing, or they're divine and they just look human. And so this is how the ideas are committed through science fiction and comic books and all this stuff. Now the result is really two. You get either a quasi-Gnosticism, where archons are these extraterrestrials, using the extraterrestrial idea. And that's where Ancient Aliens are at, that whole idea and the whole series. That aliens put us here, and that's what Prometheus, again, the film, was all about. Supposedly a prequel to Alien. Now, if you watch the movie, you wouldn't get Jesus in the movie. But if you look up the original script online by Ridley Scott, the reason why the engineers in Prometheus wanted to destroy their creation, that would be us, is because they visited us 2,000 years ago. And we put them on a cross. That's right in the script. Now, there's a detailed review that I didn't write, but somebody else wrote on, and the guy might be a Gnostic, I'm not sure what he is. But he goes through Prometheus really closely. And it's really remarkable at how many biblical elements are mixed with classical mythology, the Promethean material, in that original script. If you want that, email me and I'll send you the link. Okay, because we don't have time to go through it here. Now, what I want to focus on here, this is Prometheus, just a couple things. One of the writers to Prometheus was a guy named Damon Lindelof, Here are some of his recent credits: Cowboys and Aliens, Prometheus. The new Star Trek film coming out, he was a co-writer. And something that might appear in 2013 or 14 called 1952. 1952 is something you want to keep your eye on because this is from the blog, what's it called? It's about UFOs in film, cinematic flying saucers or something like that. And I can send you the link too. Disclosure through Disney in 2013. Disney's aborted 1950s UFO acclamation movie, is it headed for the big screen? So this entry is about the fact that this writer, Lindelof, was allowed into Disney's archives, specifically into something that no one else has gotten to see because, well, unless they're still alive that were alive in the 1950s, and that is this. In 1979, a guy named Ward Kimball, who was an Oscar-winning Disney animator, was at a MUFON symposium, MUFON, Mutual UFO Network, and he told the story that NASA, or the Air Force, approached Disney in the 1950s to request cooperation on a documentary about UFOs that would help acclimate the public to an extraterrestrial reality. According to Kimball, in exchange for that cooperation, the Air Force offered to furnish the production with genuine UFO footage. Walt Disney agreed and actually started on the project, but it was tabled when the Air Force reneged on the film. It has literally sat in a file drawer since being handed to Lindelof. And so the supposition is that 1952, okay, the year that it was canned, is what the film is about. It's about this project. Now you can go on YouTube. Disney did create a different UFO film that promoted the idea that UFOs and aliens were real. They never actually released it for public consumption. It got aired, I'm not sure where it aired, but it only aired once and it never actually made it to consumer TV. But somebody has posted it on YouTube in 3 parts. You can find it. Again, I can give you the links if you email me. Last point. There's a whole scholarly book. This is University of Chicago Press. This is a dense read. It's a scholarly book called Mutants and Mystics, Science Fiction, Superhero Comics, and the Paranormal. And guess who wrote it? Our friend Jeffrey Kripal. He has an entire chapter. If you're into UFOs, this will be shocking to you. His entire last chapter is on Whitley Strieber and communion. The whole purpose of the book is to show how comic books, and specifically the alien theme, has been a useful and wonderful and delightful vehicle for transmitting the truths of Gnosticism. I mean, they're not secretive about this. It's just, here it is, So again, I highly recommend that you read this. Again, he argues that much of the recent popular culture of the U.S. comes from what used to be called the paranormal. He has a third book called Authors of the Impossible, where he, as an academic, says academicians, scholars, ought to own up to the fact that paranormal stuff is real. And he's arguing in favor of paranormal stuff within the account. He obviously has tenure, because we're not at the point yet where we'd have whole departments of this, in every university. But he is a committed academic and a committed Gnostic. And he is extraordinarily well read in comic books, pop culture, media, movies. If for no other reason than a reference book, you ought to have that. I mean, it's just really good stuff. So Kripal identifies a super story, a modern living mythology, and beliefs concerning alien contact and humankind's place in the cosmic scheme of things. Again, showing how science fiction, and fantasy owes less to science than it does to earlier occult systems. He even goes into Madame Blavatsky. None of this is new. Okay, the whole alien thing is just rehashed Gnosticism / occultism / theosophy / whatever, fill in the blank, for a technological society. That's all it is. And it's, this is what's going to reach the masses. If you go up to the Internet Movie Database and put in the keywords Alien and 2012, for the last year, there are almost 4,000 episodes, either episodes of TV shows or movies, just for last year. That doesn't count YouTube. Okay, that's the stuff that the IMDb tracks, that's released, that you have to pay for. That is not YouTube. And don't do too much of that or you'll start to get like me. I mean, it's just depressing on one level how exhaustive an effort this is. And it's going to change the way a lot of the church does church and does Christianity, because you got two choices. You either stand in opposition to the world, or you join, you adapt. And what I'm telling you, this whole presentation comes down to this. The adaptation is going to be led by people who know what they're doing and will control the vocabulary and teach others. They will teach others to mime the vocabulary and morph the theology. And it's only going to take a generation before that becomes the articulation of what Christianity is. And why can't you get on board? Why are you so, antiquarian or just odd? Okay. So again, all of these last two sessions have really been things that have been floating around in my head because of the sequel to The Facade. So again, I'm sure you're getting tired of hearing this, but if you haven't read The Facade, you ought to. If you have, go up to the website, join the mailing list so that you can stay up to date with alerts about the sequel. And of course, the website, you can contact me and follow me on Twitter there too. So that is the end. We can wrap up. And if you want to do questions, we can try to do that, or if you got something to go to, feel free.